Ještě jednou dobré odpoledne, dámy a pánové, mé jméno je Václav Schneberger, jsem z Ligy otevřených mužů a mám tu čest dnešní odpolední seminář moderovat. Název toho semináře je Muži proti násilí na ženách a dětech, kdy jednoduše a prostě věříme tomu, že násilí, ať už opáchá kdokoliv, není pouze otázkou sociálních pracovníků nebo žen nebo nejrůznějších represivních orgánů, ale je zejména záležitostí také nás mužů, abychom k němu mluvili, vyjadřovali se a zaujímali jasné postoje. A tématem toho dnešního workshopu je vlastně představit vám příklady dobré praxe v prevenci násilí na ženách a dětech, a také příklady práce s pachateli násilí, a to ať už u nás v České republice, ve Švýcarsku, v Norsku a v Irsku. Jak dnes odpoledne budeme pracovat, je, že vyslechneme si 3,5 příspěvku od našich skvělých zahraničních kolegů, které zde tímto vítám. Oni se pak představí a představí také svoji práci, nebudu teď vyjmenovávat. A můj kolega Evžen Nový si vždycky během toho příspěvku připraví pár provokativních otázek či zamyšlení pro nás, pro všechny. A po každém tom příspěvku bude také možnost, pokud někdo to nebude moc vydržet a bude se chtít na něco zeptat, bude tak agresivní, že si to místo prostě vybojuje, tak bude možnost hned se zeptat. Nicméně bych vás zejména chtěl odkázat na tu možnost potom od 4:30 do 5, kdy může proběhnout diskuze či otázky na naše milé kolegy. Ještě mi dovolte úvodem 2 věci. Jednak poděkovat donorům této akce, bez které by se dneska nemohla konat, a to je nadace Open Society Fund z programu Dejme ženám šanci, který je financován z norských fondů, takže taky děkujeme Norům. A samozřejmě potřeba zmínit podporu Ministerstva práce a sociálních věcí. Je také pravda, že i tento seminář a hlavně účast švýcarských kolegů byla podpořena z Fondu česko-švýcarské spolupráce. Já, když jsem dostal tu možnost moderovat dnešní diskuzi, tak jsem říkal, určitě dáme největší prostor našim zahraničním kolegům, ale dovolte mi, abych hned urval co nejvíc času ještě pro PR Ligy otevřených mužů a seznámil vás s tím, co LOM jako organizace od svého vzniku vlastně pro téma práce s agresí a vůbec násilí obecně dělá. Hodně jsme o tom mluvili, je to jeden z našich programových priorit. A ačkoliv jsme velmi často podezříváni, že jsme esencialisté a myslíme si, že všechno je přirozené, tak v tomto směru věříme, že jakékoliv násilné chování je naučené kulturně, že není přirozené a proto ho taky lze odnaučit. Že je to prostě nějaká reakce na to, jakým způsobem žijeme, co žijeme, jak žijeme, co jsme se naučili, co jsme zažili. A že prostě je to věc, kterou se prostě naučíme jako nějakou reakci, ale taky ji můžeme se odnaučit. Ty počátky práce LOMu na tématu násilí se datují někdy už do roku 2006, nicméně v roce 2008 jsme se stali patrony, nebo jsme vlastně přivezli do České republiky mezinárodní kampaň, kterou určitě znáte pod názvem White Ribbon Campaign, nebo Bílá stužka proti násilí na ženách a dětech. A myslím si, že poprvé v České republice ve veřejném prostoru jsme formulovali myšlenku, že správný chlap, ať už si pod tím představíte, co chcete, nemlátí ženu a děti a že prostě fyzické tresty, ať už na komkoliv, jsou prostě nepřijatelné v našem kulturním kontextu. Posléze jsme začali realizovat, a taky jste už dostali určitě spoustu letáků nebo informací, nebo jste možná sledovali web Muži proti násilí, tak se zaměřujeme zejména na kampaň a anonymní poradnu pro ty, kteří nezvládají svou agresivitu, a v té kampani nebo i do té poradny se zapojují, ať už jsou to ženy, odborníci, muži, lidé, kteří svou agresi nezvládají, anebo organizace, které se tomuto tématu nějakým způsobem věnují. V roce 2014 jsme ve spolupráci s Reformem, což je norská organizace, nebo zahájíme, ještě úplně, jako zahájili jsme, ale ještě úplně nezačal, začal výcvik českých odborníků v metodě zvládání stresu, takzvaný anger management. Takže teďka rok se budeme připravovat, vlastně budeme vychovávat odborníky, kteří by pak pracovali s lidmi, kteří buď mají problémy s agresí, anebo se obávají toho, že by v budoucnu mohli. S tím samozřejmě souvisí, že otevřeme mužskou skupinu, protože mužské skupiny jsou nedílnou součástí práce LOMu, tak otevřeme mužskou skupinu, která bude specificky zaměřená na tato témata, na zvládání agrese. A kromě jiného také se snažíme ovlivnit ten veřejný prostor i formou, jak bych to řekl, pozitivního vybítí té agresivity. Takže LOM je jedním z partnerů Prague International Marathon, takže běháme špatně, ale běháme rádi. A prakticky nabízíme ve spolupráci s Pražským mezinárodním maratonem čísla na nejrůznější podniky tohoto seriálu, kterými ty, co si je zakoupí, tak vlastně podpoří tu bílou stužku v České republice, tak aby třeba poradna pro lidi mohla být vedena zdarma a tak dál. Připravujeme se na tu přímou práci s muži, to je jedna stránka. Druhá stránka jsou kampaně a třetí, když bych otočil třetí stránku, je, že se snažíme ovlivnit legislativu a ovlivnit strategické dokumenty české vlády, jako ve výboru pro prevenci domácího násilí, teď si to potřebuji přečíst, a samozřejmě také tato témata zaznívají v pracovní skupině Muži a rovné příležitosti žen a mužů, která v současné době připravuje zprávu pro vládu, která má pracovní název Muži a násilí v České republice. Myslím si, že toho je docela dost, ale na druhou stranu pro nás je nejdůležitější získávat jednak inspiraci a jednak také prošlapávat ty cesty, které ještě prošlapané nebyly. A tedy se inspirovat v zahraničí, a ať už dobrým či špatným příkladem. A proto bych teď rád vlastně předal slovo našim zahraničním kolegům, kteří shrnou své zkušenosti v této oblasti. A přivítal bych mezi námi tedy vedoucího poradce norské organizace Reform, Ole Bredersena Nordfjella. A předal mu slovo k jeho příspěvku metoda zvládání agrese, anger management method.
Thank you very much. We are the National Resource Center for Men in Norway, and we started up in 2002. And early we came to the conclusion that violence plays an important role in the lives of many men. Many men are targeted from violence growing up from their parents and their peers. And many men came to us and told stories of how they had used violence to their partners and asking us what to do. Our center was and is committed to working for gender equality. So I put a leaflet down there, a little bit about our organization that you can grab and look at. And our understanding is that violence towards women is the biggest obstacles towards gender equality. It's damaging for women, but it also impairs the emotional and social development of men. So this recognition with this recognition, we took the conversation with the men a step further. We developed an approach to target men and help them with their problem dealing with feelings of anger and violent behavior. And since the start, we have had about 450 men in counseling. And now, as mentioned, we have a cooperation with the League of Men to train professionals here in Prague. And this training will be quite extensive. So here and now, I'll just give a short introduction to our approach. And the picture you see on this slide is from our anger management group in Oslo, with 2 of our therapists. The other picture in the presentation are from our leaflets and other materials. I want to start by talking about the serious consequences of violence. To talk about the serious consequences is one thing we stress in our sessions. Living in an abusive relationships robs the partner for a basic security in life. It's harmful for her self-esteem. Depression and low energy is often also a consequence. Targets are often socially isolated or isolate themselves in an attempt to hide the violence. Another consequence is often seen is the inability to set limits, and physical violence is dangerous. It causes injuries and is potentially life-threatening. Each year in Norway, 10 women are killed. And because your body is often in a state of emergency, to be a target of violence or living an abusive relationship is very damaging to your health. Troubles like headache, pain in the stomach, poor appetite, difficulty to concentrate, difficult to concentrate at school or work, sleep problem, are all strongly associated with partner violence. And when it comes to children, it is now documented that it is as damaging to witness as to be direct target of violence. This brings me to my next question. Why should we use our resources to help male perpetrators of violence? The moderator made some comments on this issue, but it's the women and their children witnessing the violence that are at risk, and they are the person we primarily need our attention. To reflect on this question, I want to tell you a story. A man is standing fishing by a river, a fast-running river, and suddenly he sees a man floating down the river, about to drown, yelling for help. So the fisherman is freaked out. He takes off his boots and plunges into the water and manages to rescue the man and taking him ashore and make sure he's breathing. And when he just have done this, another man is floating down the river, about to drown, yelling for help. So he jumps into the water again, and again he manages to see that he's breathing, that it's okay. And then also a spectator who has seen all the commotion comes to the scene, and then a third man is coming floating down the river, floating for help. Then the fisherman leaves. He starts walking upstream, and the spectator asks, "Why are you leaving? Why are you leaving this poor man to drown?" And the fisherman responds, "Well, someone have to stop this man standing upstream, throwing men into the water." So I'll just let that story hang in the air for you to reflect on and continue. Norway is annually ranked as the most gender equal country in the world. We changed position with Sweden each other year, It's kind of a routine. So, but regardless of this, the most recent study show that partner violence is still a big problem in Norway. About 9% women and 2% men have been targeted for severe physical violence from their partners sometimes in their lives. And about 4 women and 0.5% of men have been raped by a partner sometime in their life. And 1/3 of both women and men have lived in a relationship with a controlling partner. These new statistics do not narrow down how many of these persons have lived in an abusive relationship with ongoing violence and with an asymmetrical power relation, because that, I think, is really the important factors. But other studies show that the persons in this smaller category, women, greatly outnumber men. To help the targets of interpersonal violence in Norway, we have for a long time had available and affordable shelters. And with the law on shelters in 2010, the quality and availability of the centers was lifted and standardized. And it does not stop there. There have been, over the last 5 years, been a political consensus that not just targets, but also perpetrators of violence must and shall have services throughout the countries. And the national capacity for low threshold as well as more intensive perpetrator programs the number are really growing. And our low threshold approach, the one that I'm presenting here and now, is one of several. But there is still a shortage of perpetrator programs. Yeah, it's the right slide. There is a shortage, but it's publicly known that if you have a problem controlling your anger or with using violence, you can get help. So the public knows this. And so the perpetrator programs makes an important shift in focus. It's not the target that is the problem. It's not the victim that it's the problem. It's the perpetrator. And therefore he needs help to stop. And this mental reorganization of violence against women is very important. So then, how do you think we help the man in question? We have great experience with putting them together and making them share experiences of anger and violence. They identify with each other and each other's troubles and stresses, and we facilitate a situation where they correct each other and hold each other accountable. It is very discomforting for most men to go public. Sorry. It was actually one of our therapists.
They beat me.
Yes, we were. It's very disturbing for the men to go public, even if it's this very small group. So they would much more likely to sit with one therapist than disclose their violence in this very small, controlled setting, and not having to mirror their violence this way. So here are some of the basics in our perpetrator programs for you to look at. We call it anger management course, and that is to lower the threshold for men to seek help. So we want to target men early in their violence career, and the name makes it easier. The target group is wide. It's men who has a problem with violence or copes with anger in an unhealthy fashion. We start off with 2 individual mapping conversation, and the approach consists of 15 group sessions over 15 weeks, and the session lasts 2 hours each week. And it's 6 to 8 participants and 2 therapists. And we have a partner contact before and after, and if needed, during the course. It is especially important with partner contact, and use the partner contact if the perception of violence of the perpetrator and the target is very different. And we have follow-up conversation with the men after the program. The program might just be a start of more therapy, or it can be an end or an observation on the development at a later stage. Together with other European partners in the Working for Perpetrators project, another project, we developed the overall standard for such programs like this. And you can find recommendation on the network page explaining requirement for Working with Perpetrators programs and going into details about why different points are important for perpetrator programs. If you Google Working with Perpetrators Network, you'll find it. An important and difficult question is why? Why do men seek help for the violent behavior? Especially in recruitment efforts, that is an important. You have to disclose and face that you have a problem with anger and violence, or both. And that is very emotionally disturbing. To pick up the phone and call us and ask, hey, you have a men's group, when does it start? Because they doesn't say anger management group, they say men's group. And I typically respond, is it the anger management group you're referring to? What brings these men to the phone? Often it is a recent aggressive episode, typically the second or third, and they feel that they have gone too far. They have been too threatening. They have lost control and are scared of themselves and feel ashamed. And they want to be a better partner. And some of them have been told by partner that the partner will leave them if they do not change. Some are more motivated, or many are motivated to be better parents, to be better fathers. That's a great motivation for many men. And some have been told or know that the Child Protection Service will take the children from them, or they will not be able to see their children if they don't go to therapy. And lastly, I think an important thing is the openness in society that there partner violence exists and there is help to get. So I think this, oh dear. Okay, yeah. Openness, the increased openness about interpersonal violence is basic for men to seek help. But this development have not come about in its own. Over the years, we and others have done extensive knowledge dissemination and advocacy against partner violence. To give an impression, here is a selection of our interviews in newspaper articles. Yeah. And here is a campaign we're currently partnering with a lot of other organizations, and it's both to set the issue on the agenda, but also to push for more prevention work against violence against women. There is especially a need for primary prevention, hindering violence to happen in the first place. So the ambassadors use a button like this, and if you look closely, you can see the Prime Minister and 3 of our ministers at this Facebook page. So what are our experiences with the men in the perpetrator program. Every participants have been against violence, but they have a very narrow definition of violence. It's physical violence, use the fists and hitting another person, and they may state that they only hit her once and that was an exception. Talking to the men, it's obvious that most have both resorted to physical, psychological, and other forms of violence. And they show inadequate knowledge about the consequences, about their knowledge to others. Starting up, they have also little understanding about the power relation between himself and the victim in the relationship. They want to be in power and control, and they are shameful. They resorting to anger and violence, have a personal learning history is also one important lesson that we have learned. So all these points we work on in the group. We let them reflect on the consequences of violence, on their children, and on their partners. And in one of the sessions, we let them take the perspective of their child. And in another session, we let them take the perspective of their partner on the violence that they are using. So, and we present, I think we go into the definition of violence and have them reflect on what kind of violence they have used as well as received. So I'll skip that slide and go to the end. So, and we are very interested in their stories of violence, why they use violence, what they felt like. We are interested in the stories and we're supporting them and getting under their skin. At the same time, we are crystal clear in the groups that is the perpetrator alone that is responsible for the violence and no one else. And for the violence to stop, for one, he must take responsibility for his action. And second, we believe that without therapy, there is little hope of change in behavior. So I'm very pleased that our organization can help build capacity for working with perpetrators here in Czechia. Thank you.
Tak já děkuji Olemu a zeptám se tady kolegy na takovou krátkou reflexi.
Česky. Otázky, ne? Teda.
No, otázky, co tě napadalo?
Jo. Mně napadá jenom tady otázka na kolegu norského. Jaký jsou vlastně limity tohoto programu? Kde vy máte nějakou takovou dělící čáru, koho vlastně přijímáte a koho už třeba nepřijímáte? Jo? Zajímavý.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So primarily, we don't work with the most serious cases. The men, of course, it's 2 sessions each over 15 weeks. So if you have a long history of using violence that's really embedded, it's too short. It's not elaborate enough. So primarily, then you need a more intensive program. Or it can be a start or to acknowledge your violence problem, but it would not be and seldom, because it's based on self-referral that they themselves take contact. So we have little experiences for people being sentenced to help coming to our program. And of course, the language is a barrier. You need to be able to talk about your problem and to be able to talk Norwegian. We also have used the same program for immigrants, and that has been important that they then are good in English, or we have run it in English as well as in Norwegian. Yeah. So if they are in the target group, we sometimes have done the exception and do it one-on-one. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Děkuji teda. Já se musím přeskočit do češtiny. Dalším příspěvkem a dalším hostem, kterého bych zde rád přivítal, je John Doyle, koordinátor programu proti domácímu násilí z organizace Mužský rozvoj, síť mužského rozvoje Men's Development Network Ireland, a představí nám příspěvek s názvem Práce s násilnými muži v Irsku, výzvy a možnosti.
Thank you. Just to say, it's a privilege to be here in this wonderful city and country, and delighted with the welcome and the hospitality we've received on our arrival. And thank you to all who have organised and participated in this. It has been already very nourishing to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about the MEND programme, which is a project of the Men's Development Network in Waterford in Ireland. And one of the interesting things is that at the moment we are redeveloping the programme, and so that gives me an opportunity to talk about how we are redeveloping it. It's similar to our Norwegian colleagues here in some of the approaches we take, so I won't go into maybe all of the reasons why we need to work with violent men, but I want to give you a picture in terms of how we've developed the programme. I think because there are conflicting models of how we are meant to work with men who are violent, and sometimes it's as if these were men who came from another planet and behave in ways that are totally different to other men or even other women or men. But in our experience, we need to look in a holistic way at how we respond to these men and see them as our brothers, part of our community, and men who have been impacted themselves. So we're looking at a model that integrates, I think, the best as far as possible of other models that have gone before us. What we're using as our kind of framework is the World Health Organization ecological model on interpersonal violence. And in a simple way, let me read what it says about interpersonal violence. The ecological framework is based on evidence that no single factor can explain why some people or groups are higher risk of interpersonal violence while others are more protected from it. This framework views interpersonal violence as the outcome of interaction among many factors at 4 levels: the individual, the relationship, the community, and the societal. And so there are the 4 areas which relate and interconnect in terms of men's experience and people's experience in their own context, in their own lives. So when we put these 4 together, at least when the World Health Organization put them together and look at them individually, they recognize that some of the societal factors that influence men's behavior is rapid social change, gender, social and economic inequalities, poverty, weak economic safety nets, poor rule of law, cultural norms that support violence. And we looked at some of that this morning in our talk about men's experience. The second level, community, where there may be poverty, high crime levels, high residential mobility, high unemployment, local illicit drug trade, and other situational factors. on the relationship level, where there may have been poor parenting practices, marital discord, violent parental conflict, low socioeconomic household status, or friends that engage in violence. And then finally, on the individual level, if someone has been a victim of child abuse or maltreatment, has psychological or personality disorders, alcohol, substance abuse, history of violent behavior. So what the World Health Organization framework tells us is that there are many factors which may be involved in an individual's use of violence. And this is just a picture of a booklet that we have rewritten from an Australian booklet, and some of them are at the end of the room if you want to have a look at them. So taking this ecological framework and turning it on its head, we have these 4 levels again. The social, where obviously the issues around gender that we've been talking about this morning and in our first presentation, and is part of that. The community, the personal, and the individuals. These all flow into each man's or each person's experience. And at any level, there's a possibility of a strengthening of a man's or a person's capability to be non-violent, or that can be undermined at any level. So in other words, what happens in their school, in their family, in their peer groups, all of that can either give them a message, it is not good to be violent, or it is good to be respectful, or it can deepen their sense that violence is okay. And so then when we meet the men, our program, the men's program, we work primarily with individuals in group, one-to-one and in group. So when we meet them, all of these experiences have been filtered down into this man who sits before us in our office when we meet him on the first occasion. And I look later at how we do that if I have time. But as I say, we work primarily with individuals. So our hope is that in the program, right from the very beginning, the assessment, the one-to-one work, and the group work, that we change that individual so that as he moves back out into his family and community, that we are then changing the nature of society from the one man out to his relationships, back out into the community, and hopefully back into society. So we meet him having been his experience of being formed within society. We get an opportunity to say, some of that was not helpful. Indeed, it was abusive to you, and now you're being abusive to others. How can we change you so that we change that dynamic and society improves following that? And we also recognize very much the intergenerational nature of intimate partner violence. Many men who sit before us say something like, one thing I wished is that I'd never become like my father. Sometimes they say that I'd never become like my mother, but I am just the same. And they know that their sons or daughters may equally be just the same. So we recognize that the best work we might do is to change the intergenerational, that it will not go on from generation to generation as it has done. And often the men we work with have had difficulties within their own intimate relationships as children, or in school, or in the community. So when we get then to the individual man sitting in front of us, what do we know from this experience? We know that a one-size-fits-all approach is not appropriate nor likely to be effective. Does that phrase in Czech make sense? A one-size-fits-all? Does that phrase, can people nod their heads? Yes? So we cannot just say, this man is a perpetrator of domestic violence, therefore this is how he is, and this is what we need to do to make him better. We don't treat the men as if they are all, carbon cutouts of our cartoon figures, like we saw this morning. We have to see them as individuals. So one-size-fits-all approach won't work. And there has to be there is a continuum of behavior with different responses required. Some men may need simply to have a custodial system or sentence. They may need to go to prison because they're not interested in change, and somebody has to come in and say, you cannot behave this way, you're not willing to change, so therefore you need to go to prison. Others may need intervention programs, one-to-one work, and at a certain part of the continuum, it may be appropriate to have couples work. So in other words, it's important to see when we think about men who are perpetrators of domestic violence or interpartner violence, that they are unique in many ways, and responses need to be linked to how they are. Different treatment responses and priorities depending on how an individual manages mentally and psychobiologically with unresolved conscious and unconscious material from the past. That sounds very complicated in English when I read it, so I don't know how it sounds in Czech. But basically what it, in simple thing is that each men will manage their past experience in different ways. And I mean that, and we all manage our experience from childhood in particular ways, right down to our body structure. Our posture has been shaped by our experience. Our language, our fears, our desires. So when somebody shows up, they present their past to you, but much of that past is unconscious. So they don't know maybe if they're sitting like this, and you say, how are you feeling? They might say, I'm feeling really fine. And you think, you're sitting here, you're crouched over, you don't look fine, you don't look energized. Because they're expressing often an unconscious experience of being depressed, but it is their everyday experience of life, so they think, I'm fine. So part of our work and our response is to notice in individual situations, what are the men presenting right from their lives today, but going right back to their childhood experiences which formed and shaped them in many ways, as it did with all of us. So violent men are not a homogeneous group, so they're not all the same. Obviously, male gender conditioning, which was spoken about again this morning, and which I won't go into too much, where men get messages still certainly in Ireland, big boys don't cry, don't ask for help, don't be such a sissy, be brave, strong and self-reliant, be a man, meaning be a macho man up, be tough, take control, take charge. All of these conditioning statements go into the man, but what's significant for our work is that they both undermine the man's natural and normal feelings that evoke vulnerability. So when the man feels vulnerable or fearful, they undermine that. And that also is an undermining of women, because often the men then see that women represent this vulnerable place as well, or are more easily express that. So as men grow to undervalue and deny their own vulnerability in childhood, unconsciously, or maybe consciously sometimes, they want to deny that vulnerability, which can often be present in their partners or in women as well. So a very healthy, we could say, feminine quality has been rejected. But the other thing in this group of men is that early childhood experience is significant, and also early childhood trauma and loss. Many men come to us and their partners say to us something like, he wasn't the same since his brother died, since his brother committed suicide. He wasn't the same since his father or mother died. And they're not making that up. So things that happen in those early childhood years are formative and can create things like anxious, insecure attachment with primary caretakers, normal personality strategies that may be unhelpful in relationships, which means that we all take on at an early stage strategies to survive. If your strategy is to avoid people because it was safer to avoid maybe your parents and just play in your room by yourself, then you may want to avoid your partner sometimes. So we have strategies which are reasonably normal, and you won't be sent to a psychiatrist for it, but they're not necessarily helpful. Then the experience of domestic violence as a child, personality disorders, traumatic events which are experienced as a threat to your life, and that could be a simple thing, but it could feel like a threat. We have a man who has been violent, and one of the things that happened in his early childhood was that he had a very serious, a pot of boiling water was poured on him, and he had to spend time away from the family home, and he had very little contact, and somehow that made a very significant, that break in the attachment at an early stage was very significant. Early loss of significant adults, again, we know that. Addictions as a response to trauma, which they often are. All of these create the man in front of us in the room. And I'll just give you one quote here. Experiences in infancy which result in the child's inability to regulate strong emotions are too often the overlooked source of violence in children and adults. I think it's worth another reading of that. Experiences in infancy which result in the child's inability to regulate strong emotions are too often the overlooked source of violence in children and adults. So that's important, because often we talk about anger, and whereas anger is simply an emotion, anger is no better nor worse than love, than fear, than grief. But if we cannot regulate strong emotions, often men will use anger as a defense, as a way of not feeling something more deeply. And often that's a very early experience of being unable to regulate those emotions. And then these two work together, the last two. So what has happened where the message we get as children that our vulnerability is not okay, that our need for help, that we have to be strong, this works with the other part, where if that is on top of very difficult early childhood experiences, then the men in front of us struggle to manage normal but very strong experiences, and they then need to control the world around them so that those feelings are not evoked. So if I cannot manage what's inside of me, I need to manage you so that you don't trigger that. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. Now, this is an important point. By endeavoring to understand the roots of violence, we do not dismiss personal responsibility, but rather look for a pathway to support responsibility and enable change. So we don't say to the men, oh, you had a difficult past, or you have strong particular gender conditioning, therefore do what you like. You can behave any way you like because, you know, you had that experience. No. But we do recognize these significant experiences and say, but you are responsible for managing your behavior, and we're going to try and help you do that. Okay, I have a long quote here from a man who was a trainer of some of the work that we've done, and he describes his own experience, and I think this is kind of helpful in his own journey. I have had to shift from aggression to assertion, learn to express my pain and anxiety as grief and fear rather than rage and withdrawal, and accept relationship intimacy and compromise over independence, distance, and selfishness. This has made me neither passive nor guilty, but I have become more vulnerable, more human, more warm, and more willing to say sorry when I am in the wrong. This willingness to be vulnerable is a softness I value, and not only vital and alive, but an essential part of my assertiveness. My experiences of working with men is that these vulnerable qualities are what are missing, often alongside an inability to be assertive rather than aggressive. Becoming more feminine or masculine does not come into it. Broadening their human qualities and experiences to become more inclusive does. So very quickly, looking at the program. So if we're looking at experiences which are rooted often in childhood, then how we work with these men is important. not just that we tell them to be different. And in working with men who use violence, it is crucial that we do not become abusive as a way of achieving behavior change. It's really interesting that the men are often acting out of a negative sense of masculinity, and often people who want to change them use the same tactics. So we want them, you be accountable, and we get kind of almost aggressive sometimes with them. We want to nearly force them to change. But that will not repair the broken relationship or the isolation that sometimes is at the heart of the experience. So to facilitate change, workers must be able to be present to themselves and to the group in a way that models the behavior change the program wants to enable in the men. Qualities we see in good, effective practice. So I'm just giving you a picture of 4 different key qualities. Often the violence is linked to relationship going wrong. So relationship is important in how we relate to the men individually and in group. Qualities such as being present. This morning somebody mentioned presenteeism, which I hadn't heard of till I came here. So we can often be in working with men but not even be present because we're going through the work rather than, well, how am I in myself in the moment? So being present, connected, attuned and embodied, being curious and reflective listening. So these are qualities which we bring into the relationship as a way of healing the relationship that has been broken, but also as a way of increasing motivation for change. Compassion. Now, compassion is not the same as collusion, which is very different. Compassion, the quality to have empathy, open-hearted, vulnerable, respectful, and have a certain sense of spacious. Now, when you read these words, you might be thinking, oh, that's a bit soft in a way. But what we have to get is a balanced gender response. And when I say, or rather a balanced response with both good, feminine and masculine qualities. And the last piece then is purpose. So the programs that we work with the men, we have an intention to get them somewhere. It's not a freewheeling therapy group interested in the man's journey. We have a context which is for the men to end violence and become respectful. And that is the frame, that is the structure. So it is quite direct, focused. The men are challenged. They learn to contain themselves and they learn how to become responsible in a healthy way. So I want to emphasize, and you could put different things there, but what I want to emphasize is in working with the men, we need to build good relationships. We need to be present to ourselves, not as experts or people who have the answer, but as people who can model being present. And how do we manage our own difficult emotions, our own fears and anxieties, sitting in a room of men who maybe have been quite violent and have maybe lacked compassion in the past? How can we stay compassionate? How can we stay present? But how can we have a very clear purpose so the men do not think that they're here just about their childhood problems? They are here for key, purposeful change. Now, I just want to give you a very brief example then of the redevelopment of our program, because we're looking at developing it into 3 phases, distinct phases. Now, this is only giving you some very broad indicators of what might be in these phases. It's very important in the first phase of work with men who are violent that we establish safety. As soon as possible, the men learn to find ways of taking time out, knowing when they're getting angry or agitated, learning what to do so that they can calm themselves down in any situation, any difficult situation. So we take a lot of time to do that, and they learn lots of resources to do that. In the second phase, we're looking at, again, that process continues, but we look more at issues around male gender conditioning, attitudes towards women, and we're looking at how they might need to have a restorative act, how they need to make up in a very real way for the ways they behaved with their partner or with their children, whether they are in together or not. So while phase 2 is looking, or phase 1 is really looking at safety, stability, to manage that. The second phase is a bit more interactive in terms of their children, their partners, and their own story about how they get to where they are. And then the final phase, in a sense, is going back out into the world. So they may be looking at things around parenting, or maybe more deep one-to-one work, counselling, and building resources and skills that they will need. Because the one thing that we'll say about the programs, which is often forgotten, there is no program to change people. Change is an ongoing process. So men learn things to practice that they need to continue to practice. In other words, we don't put a stamp on their head and say, this man has changed, and off he goes. We know that if he works and does what he's learned in the program, he will maintain change. If he doesn't, he may return to similar situations. Thank you. So there are the three. And then very quickly, each of these phases, there's certain key things that run right through the program. So partner safety is essential, because the men who come on the program, which is 32 weeks in length, 2 hours a week, their partners get one-to-one support, and there are risk management meetings on a monthly basis to discuss how the man is doing, how his partner is doing, and to manage the partner safety right throughout the program. Child protection, all the men know that if an issue comes up around child protection, we will report that to the social workers. We will tell them about it and we report it. So child protection issues right through the program are kept to the fore. Live issues. The program works very much around what is happening in the man's life at the moment. So a piece of the group, which is 2 hours long, maybe half an hour to an hour, will look at what's happening at the moment in the man's life. What problems are arising? And is he using the tools he's learning to stay mindful, to stay present? So that goes right through all the time, coming back to live issues, what's happening in the daily life. Mindful awareness. There is a lot of scientific research done on this, the outcomes from people learning to be mindful, which means being able to pay attention to their own bodies in a certain way. Many of the men, their whole lives is taken up with not paying attention to what's going on inside them. And it's a really challenging thing as we move through the stages of the program, that the men learn to tolerate very difficult experiences that may be rooted in the past. They learn ways of so they do not have to dump it on their partners. They do not have to repress it, because then they're just holding it and like that under pressure. So that goes right through the program, bring the man, and it's a simple statement, which is, when you say that, what do you notice happening in your body? When you talk about your partner, when you talk about that incident, what do you notice happening right now? You feel agitated. Is it okay to stay with that agitation? Just stay for a little longer and see, can you manage that? Is that okay? So the men learn in a live way. It's okay to feel vulnerable. It's okay to feel the ground shake beneath you out of fear or anxiety. You can manage that. You don't need to control your boss, your partner, your body. You can actually be with that. And when the men get that, it's very empowering, and it's very empowering for partners and for children to see that happen and for that to go on into the next generation. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you again.
Thank you, John. Díky, Johne. Všené otázka, reflexe.
Mně se moc líbil na začátku, jak jste mluvil o tom ekologickém modelu, který vlastně zahrnuje od té individuální úrovně až po nějakou takovou makrosociální. A mě by zajímalo, protože tady u nás vlastně v Čechách, tak ta společnost poměrně za tu poslední dobu prošla takovým docela bouřlivým vývojem a myslím si, že se tady jako hodně mění vzorce chování. Jak to sledujete vlastně u vás, jo? Kde přeci jenom ta společnost je nějakou pro delší dobu jakoby stabilnější, že se třeba mění vzorce toho agresivního chování u lidí, jo? Jestli vidíte nějakou takovou změnu, která se odehrává víc té společnosti než na té individuální úrovni.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very difficult. I mean, Ireland comes from a colonial past, so we were a colonized country, and I think part of that experience. Sorry, I'm trying to turn down that. Yeah, so things that happen on a social level filter down into how, for example, if you think a simple story when I think when Anna was bringing us from the airport to the hotel and we were crossing the street and we were talking about how Irish people will never wait for the lights to go green or will not necessarily walk across the pedestrian. We will walk wherever we can. We will walk across a road and nearly get knocked down, because we want always to be against the authority, because England were our masters for many years. And I think we can take in attitudes, say, to authority and to power in particular. You know, the very terrible thing is that power is being abused, and often in relationships, instead of really both parties being powerful, it's either one is sometime and then maybe the other is, and power is not really spoken of in a very open way. Power, anger, intimacy, these words. And I think often it can go back to society, are colonized, and then we were also in a sense colonized by the church in Ireland. So our Catholic past, attitudes towards sexuality, attitudes to the role of men and women. And so certainly these create a layer of unconscious reaction to things that only now, and I think we are still very early in our journey away from repression as a colonized country and repression from religious institutions which fed into educational institutions. And that then does feed into what does it mean to be powerful? What does it mean to be loving? What does it mean to be sexual? And to really own that for ourselves. So I think a lot of these things, society creates a context, and that can really shape us.
Díky Johne. Tak a dovolte mi uvést poslední příspěvek před samozřejmě otázkami či diskuzí z vaší strany v plénu. A rád bych mezi námi přivítal dva švýcarské muže, Markuse Teunerta a Andrease Bortra. Oba dva pracují v organizaci Manner a připravili si pro nás takový krátký vstup na téma, jak oni pracují s násilnými osobami, nebo jaká je praxe v práci s násilnými osobami muži, lépe řečeno ve Švýcarsku. Takže máte slovo.
Hello, dobrý den once again. This time we change roles. I will make a short introduction and then pass the word to Andreas Porter. First of all, I would really like to thank you for the invitation to this conference and for the starting point now of this Swiss-Czech cooperation. We are happy to be here. I just want to say some words to our the second slide, if you could change. this one. In some way, it's a less differentiated model of the ecological model John presented to us. Andreas will talk to you about the three inner elements: victims, perpetrators, and prevention options. I just want to talk about the frame. I was really glad to hear John to name the importance of these ecological and societal factors at one side. On the other side, for me, for us, from our advocacy point of view, we go a step further. We don't stay at the simple description that all these factors influence male violence, but we conclude that it is our genuine task as association working for and with gender equality oriented men to address these factors and to fight against them. I want to explain you what I mean. We live in a violent world. So therefore we can't really be surprised that there is a lot of violence and there are a lot of violent men. And we have to state that first, we live in a violent world and violence is widely accepted by our authorities. We are even educated being violent in some fields, for example, military services. We, I mean men, are trained being violent in some fields and blamed being violent in other fields. Sure, we have to do all what you told in work with perpetrators, but we can't only blame the perpetrators as not social, abusive. We have also to blame the system who led these men being perpetrators. Sometimes doing this work in Switzerland, I'm getting suspicious. And this is a difficult issue to talk about here. I get, for example, suspicious if I hear about these campaigns, men against violence, against women and children. Not because I would have a problem with that, sure, that's highly necessary, but we can forget that 70% of all victims are men. In the main part of cases, victims of other men's violence, sure, but being a victim is not something which is typical for women. Typical is male violence, male physical violence, and the connection between this violence and system features. So from our point of view, we have to do all this work. Andreas will explain you how we work with perpetrators in Switzerland specifically, and to do some advocacy work as prevention of all that. And advocacy work as prevention of male violence in our terms means doing a gender equality oriented men's policy. We call it like this. This is a reader I edited last year, 2 years ago, trying to synthesize different approaches which all go to the direction of, yes, gender equality as a premise. Sure, gender equality, that's the goal. But the question remains what contributions boys, men and fathers can do to reach gender equality. And from our point of view, it's more than supporting women in their battle for gender equality. It's there are own contributions from a male perspective and from the male positioning within a world which is not a man's world from my point of view, but a world where the power stems from a very male principle. We name it the principle of the principle of exploitation of ourselves and others. We are trained not to recognize our limits. We are trained to perform and not to ask how we feel, if we can and if we want to do something. That's the basic of our economic system. So no wonder if we live in a world where these rules are in force, that we have troubles on an individual level to separate these different systems and different rules. And I come to the conclusion. I hope that we do this work in terms of a double perspective, in loyalty to these men, the concerned men, in illoyalty towards the behavior, and in advocacy for a system, for values, for a societal surrounding and political regulations which allow all of us to live without necessity to act violent or to feel violent or to behave violent to ourselves and towards others. Thank you for the attention for these first remarks, and now I pass the word to Andreas.
Thank you, Marcus. Somehow I feel that we would be ready now even for discussions or even for debate. I think this afternoon it should be also the possibility to really debate. But let me add some points. Maybe, as Marcus said, we are approaching now, it may be a little different from the other speakers, really from the NGO perspective. We both are not actually involved in the actual work with perpetrators. On my personal field, it's also work I'm doing as a counselor with perpetrators on a special field. I'm a specialist in questions of sexual harassment. And I'm working in companies with men and women who have a problem in this sense. So it's also a form, and that brings me back to one thing which Marcus has said. We try as an umbrella organization to help that the different fields of the work with the violent men are not isolated. So we try to pick up here to see not just the perpetrators, but also on the side of victims. And as I put it here, to really to not separate the counseling work from the work of prevention. One of the problems we see that many of experiences are done in counseling, and we have not the means, at least in Switzerland, to put it into measurements of prevention. And a lot of experience should be shaped and reframed in the field of prevention, as you said already. So we have no really resources to do that. But we try really to not separate and to really see how we can bring things together. And also what is important, as Marcus said already, it's really important to us to keep in mind the different forms of violence. And in the discussion to us, sometimes it's too quickly just the field of domestic violence. It's also the domestic violence topic this afternoon, but it is very important to us that we see the other fields and also the connections. For instance, in the Swiss context, just to give you one example, in Switzerland, one of the problems is that young men or family men all have the guns from the military at home. So, but it's not dealt in the field of domestic violence with the fact and with the political fact that the guns are at home. And so there is not enough impact on these questions. Also the violence I'm working with sexual harassment and so with the interconnections are not here. And also not interconnections between work with victims and perpetrators. And also men are just, like Marcus also said, are isolated and just looked at men as perpetrators and not as victims. I think to deal also with the questions of men as being victims of violence in all these fields is very important. It cannot be separated. And to us, that the discussion is too quickly narrowed to perpetrators, to men as perpetrators. And we in Switzerland try to look always on men and on women, not in the way of comparing who is more violent and who is poor and who is rich, but just to say there are different ways of being violent, for instance, and we have also in the field of research, I will come back to that later, we just don't know enough about the different ways men and women are doing things as victims and as perpetrators. And yeah, it's just a strong statement for not separating those different things. Because of time, I will not focus on the general situation on mainly domestic violence, but I thought it could be in Switzerland. It's quite similar to European countries. Maybe a slight difference from what you said as in form of men being victims. Then news research shows that 20% in Switzerland of men are victims. But maybe it could be interesting to show a little more about the organizational level. I'm coming from an NGO, and also about maybe the difficulties or the challenges we are confronted with as being an organization who tries to implement those programs. And it's a cooperation of three levels in the work with perpetrators which are important. First, just the whole approach through the NGOs, and I would like to share some experiences we make with the topic as an NGO, and then the cooperation with the state, and also the work on methodologies. Let me start with the NGO level. In Switzerland, and I think it's true in many other countries, the work with perpetrators has started through the men's movement. That really small men's group in different parts of our country became promoters for such programs and said, we as men don't want to be a part of a society where violence against women mainly is normal. So it came, and since 1918, different groups in Switzerland have been building up counseling services to counsel with violent men. So it really comes out in Switzerland of this NGO movement. At the moment, we have about 25 institutions working with perpetrators in Switzerland, most of them still NGOs, with very different backgrounds, some larger, some small. But yeah, I think maybe even more, there are 25 officially registered organizations doing this work. And what's important, they all took away from volunteers to professional work. Many counselors started really out as volunteers, or did it. These were somehow professionals, but they worked as professionals as volunteers. And more they are moving in as professionals, but nearly nobody has really a position. They do it besides their work as counsel. So it's very difficult to come up and to build up a real professional structure in Switzerland for the topic. So that means we can only really work on this issue when we cooperate with state structures. And it was a good field, about the first field where we could really make experience of cooperation with state agencies. We have no other field, and it could be maybe interesting also for you in this country to really have a field to prove how it works and to exercise how this cooperation could work, also with the women's groups, with shelter movement, and so it's not easy, but it's a good platform to get used to this kind of work. What is a big topic, and astonishingly, this afternoon I have little heard about you about finances. The big challenge to us always for those NGOs is challenges. It's finances. on one hand, it's the only field which generates funds for our men's organizations. And it's not easy because some of the offices are reduced then to these topics, but they do other things, and it leads to very strange situations. For instance, I can tell you my colleagues in the offices, in the counseling offices, they have to have records of how many of the men they're coming for counseling have a violence problem. And they hope, of course, that as many men as possible have a violence problem, because then they can make a stretch and then we'll get money for this. And they really try in the counseling process in 2000, if ever this man coming to the office could have some kind of violence problems in order to be able to get money. It's strange, but it's the way it works. And it makes some organizations also dependent on the topic and on the state strange funding of men's work. So to say it a little on this way. Yeah. One of the things which is also very important for the NGOs is the whole question of shelters. From the beginning, there was not an easy debate with women's shelters, and we have now the debate on men's shelters, which is not an easy debate either. We have 2 or 3 men's shelters in Switzerland, all led by NGOs. But it's not easy to get funds for men's shelters. But could tell more you about that. I have been engaged in this field. Yeah. So for NGOs, it's important to have also concrete fields of action in the shelter movement. And the last point for this topic, it's like we have here the chance to have international contacts on the issue, to see it in a political frame. We are also a part of the International Men Engage Alliance. So to make it a little shorter, what is important on the level of the state, it's of course that also as an NGO we are confronted with the whole legal framework, that we give also impact on the legal level, have discussions on that. The tendency also in all legal frameworks is the tendency from the help for victims, very much the focus first on the victims, to intervention programs. And in the last few years, mainly since 24, there is not just a look on the victims, but there is the possibility of persecuting the delicts. It was really a big step, and we have different steps. Like in 2007, there is the possibility only from the law to the right for a protection from violence, and barring orders and all these kind of steps were very important. We have new laws, for instance, since 2009 only, the possibility, for instance, to order trainings for perpetrators. It was also a very big step. It's difficult in Switzerland a little, because there is a big independence in the cantons. And it could happen that you have the possibility to really order a training for a perpetrator in one canton, but if he moves out of the canton, in the next canton, it's not possible. So yeah, and the last point here on the framework, which is important, that we have also the possibility to implement programs to prevent violence. And I really think we have also, in a broad view, to see that you don't need just program to combat, but also to prevent. And that's one of the focus we'll be looking at in the next time. On the state level, yeah, my time, it's very important that we have a national coordination, also that the government, the state coordinates all the programs in Switzerland. It looks, for instance, to give you one example by coordination, what the costs are, the full costs of violence, what does it cost our society. It was a very important report that we really know now how much does violence, domestic violence costs to all departments of the budget. This is one of the topics, and also in the field of research. And what they put up now, which also was very important for the for the institutions doing it, there is a toolbox on domestic violence where you see all the programs. You can be looked at all the programs which are implemented in Switzerland in all languages and all kind of the things you get all in an official toolbox. You can look at the programs. It was very important to have and to be accepted. Also, all the actors could see in all the languages. You can see in this toolbox all the best practices. It's all seen publicly now. So that's on the state level. To make it a little shorter, we in the methodology level, we had a big impact, a big movement. I don't know if you know it, in the German-speaking part, it was a movement, the Hamburg model, which was really a special approach to work with perpetrators, but it gives somehow through the German-speaking countries a kind of common language. How to deal, how implement, which kind of standards we have. So it was on this side. On the other side, we had some standards through the DIPE intervention programs in the US, which really helped as an example how to work together with state agencies, because it's really a challenge because we work with police and other actors, and it's just not easy to build up confidence. And as much you can build up confidence in these settings, you also can build up confidence in the issue. But it's a long way. We came a long way and still have a long way to go. It is still a kind also of a gender debate. And it brings me to the last point, to the challenges and the perspectives. Some of them I have already mentioned. It's on the level of research. We really need more research, as I did before, on the different reasons, forms of male and female violence. We have very little knowledge about that, how it really actually works. Then one thing we also are involved is in prevention. We want to have some more research on care involvement. That's the topic of the morning. What does care involvement has for an impact as a prevention for male violence? So we really want to have, and we have no data on that. And the whole question of men and vulnerability, we have no research how men really what they do with their vulnerability also in everyday life, and in the exchange of best practice, we just have the exchange on programs but not on prevention measures. So we want to have a focus on that. And on the level of quality, we really, what you have maybe in Ireland, we don't have really actual standards for work with perpetrators, which are for all the 28 actors in the field. And especially, we want to build up specific forms of counseling with men. Also in the whole field of counseling, there is not really a specificity. What does it really mean to also for family centers? What's specific about counseling men? Who can do it? How you do it? So we don't have enough knowledge and exchange. Also on a university level in psychology, it's not a topic really yet. And the last part is just the whole gender dialogue. We are, as an organization, very much involved in, also on a national level. And the question of violence is in the gender dialogue a permanent topic. So just also even the definition of violence, what is violence all about, and the question, as I said, of shelter. So these are issues, and we stay very alive in this gender dialogue. We have quite a bit on debates, but it's good because we have to learn also sometimes a non-violent dialogue in the gender dialogue to come further with the issue. Thank you very much.
Tak já jsem zachytil na začátku takovou velmi zajímavou myšlenku, že vlastně já už to počkám, až na začátku vlastně toho vašeho úvodu, tak jsem zachytil takovou zajímavou myšlenku, že určité formy toho násilného chování jsme vlastně učeni, jo, jste použili trained slovo, a zase za některé jsme potom jako trestáni, jo, nebo nějak obviňováni. Tak bych se chtěl zeptat, v kterých oblastech vy vidíte nejvíc tenhle ten rozpor a jestli to sledujete taky u žen. Nebo je to pouze oblast, já teďka nevím, jestli jsem se vyjádřil dost jasně. Jo, na začátku jste...
The obvious example is military service, but I think we should be a little bit more subtle in perceiving forms of violence, particularly violence toward ourselves. And there I would state it that the beginning of violent behavior is starting quite early. I mean, for example, I'm sitting here quite sick, and I'm not so sure if this is not a form of violent behavior towards myself already. And towards, yeah. Yeah, I don't mean it rhetoric. I'm not sure. And I think there are many everyday life experiences where there is some element of violence forcing myself to a behavior which I don't really want to do, and yeah, we get used to ignore these borders and not even to remark them anymore. And sure, the more women are allowed to behave like men, the more they are also trained to ignore their own limits and to be violent towards themselves and towards others.
Tak, já poděkuji švýcarským kolegům také za jejich příspěvek. Nyní bych rád otevřel diskuzi nebo otázky a věřím tomu, že Ole, John, Markus a Andreas jsou velmi otevření muži, protože jsme pozvala je Liga otevřených mužů, tak jsou otevření a rádi odpoví na všechny vaše otázky či okomentují nějaký váš komentář. Takže jenom bych vás poprosil, dostanete mikrofon, jestli byste se mohli představit a také třeba svou otázku zaměřit na některého z hostů. Děkuji.
Dobrý den, já jsem Kristýna Pešáková z neziskové organizace Nesehnutí, která se zabývá mimo jiné genderovou problematikou. A já bych ráda trošku reagovala ještě na tu poslední diskuzi, která tady byla a asi obrátila svůj dotaz zejména na švýcarské pány, ale určitě mě zajímá reakce i ostatních. A to, jestli vy vlastně žijete v zemích, kde se dá říct, že jakoby rovnost příležitostí mezi muži a ženami je na vyšší úrovni než v České republice. A já jsem se chtěla zeptat, jestli nějak jakoby uvažujete o definici domácího násilí jako takového, o kterém se tady bavíme, protože v České republice se jakoby převažuje to vnímání domácího násilí pořád v té jakoby rovnici muž pachatel, žena oběť. Ale jestli máte pocit, že tím, že dochází k vyrovnanějším možnostem žen a mužů ve vašich zemích, jestli se tohle nějak jako mění a jestli třeba víte o tom, že by vzrůstal počet ženských pachatelek díky třeba lepšímu postavení žen ve vašich zemích, nebo jestli z vašeho úhlu pohledu si myslíte, že by se ta definice domácího násilí nebo ten teoretický přístup k ní měl nějakým způsobem měnit.
Tak já poděkuji za otázku a dám slovo nejdřív.
Interesting questions. I just give some spotlights and perhaps it becomes a whole picture. For example, we know that domestic violence, relationship violence doesn't differ if you look heterosexual couples, homosexual gay couples and homosexual lesbian couples. So obviously it's not directly linked to the sex, but there has something to do with gender, and relationships seem to have a tendency to implement some kind of power disbalances which lead to violence. Second observation, and I think that's really quite an interesting contradiction, Ole. You were starting with saying that violence is one of the key factors, or the crucial factor, or the crucial hurdle on the way to gender equality. And at the same time, you report that the rates of domestic violence in Norway, as well as in Sweden, are exactly the same as in the rest of Europe, which is behind the Scandinavian countries in terms of gender equality. So I'm not so sure, or it's an obvious contradiction, and it would be interesting if you could say something to that issue.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
I think this exercise to compare nations' level of domestic violence is very difficult, because we have the processes of labeling what is domestic violence is different from each country. So I know I can't document it, but I think it's obvious that in Norway we are much faster to label something as domestic violence and to live in an abusive relationship now than we did 10 years ago. So if our statistics are the same, it doesn't necessarily mean that the level of violence is the same. In 1970 in Norway, or in 1960, we hadn't invented domestic violence. What does that mean? That it didn't exist? Of course it existed. It was perceived as something their partnership didn't work. So I think that this cooperation, to look at the country's statistics is difficult. But what the statistics that I showed is, you can see that it's still a problem in Norway. We have raised the standard what is domestic violence, so that more people are seeking help. And what is also obvious is that much more women are targeted for domestic abuse when we ask the public. So in serious, of course, in less serious domestic abuse, the statistic is not so different. But when you see who is repeatedly attacked and who is also living in an unequal relationship, there are more women who are vulnerable, and the shelters in Norway are still filled with women each year. So I think that this gender side, I would not like to ungender domestic violence, but I think that if you, of course, it's not better for a man to live in an abusive relationship than a woman, and of course, men living in an abusive relationship must have help. There should be help. Shelters for men as well. In Norway, with the shelter law, the shelters are open to men as well. And as it's getting more known, there is also more men coming to shelters. But we wouldn't have that development if we didn't have that women's movement didn't bring shelters there in the first place and didn't fight for it. So it's really continuation of a feminist project, the way I see it. So yeah. But also, just want to comment on this. I would also like to gender men violence and military service. State violence is highly gender masculinized. So I think we should do that as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to give a word to John, and then you, if you want to react. Okay.
There are a lot of ideas going around in my head that won't necessarily stack up to hold together. But I think one of the things we overlook is that relationships are not easy. And I think often we have what we talk about domestic violence, and it's linked with something. And it's almost, when we think of it, certainly in Ireland, we think about it something that happens in the home, because that's where the man can control the woman. And I think then we miss the fact that really it happens within intimate relationship, where issues of control and anger and hurt all are quite intensified. And I think part of the problem is that even as we resolve the issue slowly around gender equality, there is often also still a lot of pressure on family. So when the child is being born at the moment into a home where parents may be under severe pressure, where their capacity to build a bond of love and intimacy is under huge pressure, then I think we may see domestic violence continue, because violences continue and it may not have the same gendered underpinning in a society where there's more equality. But what's the cost of that equality if both parents are absent from the home, or if both parents are under pressure? So I think that domestic violence in itself cannot be contained and explained as one particular phenomenon, but over time different things put pressure on relationship. And I think that, you know, so I think that if we look for a simplistic reason and solution, it's difficult. So I think gender is always going to be an issue, especially because maybe of, again, the physicality of men and the different biological makeup of men, so their use of violence has maybe stronger impact. But I think, again, as our colleagues have said, as women enter into the workforce, as women enter into the situations where they are getting the same illnesses which men got 20 years ago, I think similarly those pressures may lead to violent and abusive behavior. It may not be physical, it may be different. So I think we really have to look closely at when we use the gendered frame, and when we use other frames when we look at what happens within the family situation. Does that make any sense?
Yep. Thank you, John.
Andreas, yeah, made just a few words to your questions. In our gender debate, really is still the question on defining domestic violence. So it's always still not very clear what impact psychic violence has, and the connection between physical and psychic violence. And from whatever perspective you look at the issue, there also the numbers are differing. And so it's also very a big question how you even can count the cases, because there is, as you know, a large number of what we call dark violence, and it's not reported. And we know that a big part of the violence against men, domestic violence against men, is not reported. So it's very, very difficult to compare and to deal. And the consequences for the counseling part is that we try to look also more at the problem in counseling as a relational problem. And even in counseling, look at the family or the partnership as a system, and not also in counseling to separate so quickly perpetrators and victims. And I make the same experience as a counselor in sexual harassment. It's always when it comes to my desk, it's very clear who is the perpetrator. And I tell you, in the companies, it's mostly never clear who actually is the perpetrator and the victim. It is always in sexual harassment, I can tell you for 10 years of experience, it's always an interference between the two. And more of them is also in domestic violence. But we split it, as I said in the beginning, very quickly in the field of perpetrators and victims.
Thank you. I'd like to rád bych dal teď příležitost dalšímu dotazu nebo komentáři z vaší strany. Opět vás poprosím, jestli byste se mohli představit a na koho se obracíte.
Dobrý den, tady Tomáš Hajný. Pracuju v mužských skupinách asi 6 let s agresory. A mě by zajímalo, jakým způsobem jsou klienti motivovaní k dostupu do skupin, jestli to určuje třeba někdy mi je posílala policie České republiky, soud a tak dále, takže ta motivace byla různá. A jakým způsobem, jak dlouho jsou ve skupinách, jak probíhá doléčování, takový ten konkrétní rámec, protože jako můžeme se tady bavit o tom, o genderu a tak, ale jak konkrétně pracovat, jak dlouho, s kým, s motivací a tak. Děkuju. Na pana Sirska? Ten mluvil o skupinách, tak asi není.
The question goes to John. Yeah.
Similarly, we have referrals that come to the programs from the probation officers, from the social workers, from counselling services, from from doctors, general practitioners, and also self-referrals. And the motivation varies between all of those men. Some have no motivation in the sense that they have been sent and they're there because they've been sent there, and they may be quite minimizing of their behavior or not accept that they have a problem. And then some of the men come, it's a bit like what was said earlier there, where men come when they behave in a way which they get quite a shock in terms of how they behave. So there's been an incident where they've got a shock and they realize, oh my, you know, that something has to change, or their partner has said they're going to leave them if they don't get help. So again, you have different types of motivation. And to be very clear on our program, which is a 32-week program, we do not take men, no matter who refers them, who deny they have a problem or who have no motivation. So that is, they will not be taken on board. We do work with them. We have a very comprehensive assessment process, and part of that is to try to build motivation. But sometimes it's very clear from the first 5 minutes that that won't work. But if there's any motivation, we try to build it. And so they have an assessment, and they may have a lead-in of one-to-one sessions. So they may have 6 or 7 one-to-one sessions, and then they go into the group, which is co-facilitated by a male and female facilitator for 32 weeks. Unfortunately, the only follow-up we offer is that we're there at the end of the line, or the men can repeat the program. And I think, like in many programs, even though the content is often the same, it's the stories of the men that make up a lot of the work. So if you repeated a program, it would be very valuable, because it'd be different stories and a different kind of different groups, so that we really rely very much on the men's participation to form the group. So does that answer? Is that it? Thank you.
And I'd like to move this question to Ole as well, because he's doing Já bych se chtěl zeptat Oleho vlastně na to samý, jako z Norska, tu zkušenost, protože on taky pracuje v mužských skupinách.
Yes. So what is the motivation for men to come to the group? They are referred themselves to the group, so it's very similar to what John said and what I said in my presentation. So it's often an incident that are motivated, and they want to get better, improve themselves as partner, especially as fathers. We have a lot of men coming to our groups and wanting to participate in our programs, and we cannot accept everyone. So we prioritize fathers, and being a good father and having improved relationship to the children is, I think, the strongest motivation for the men in the group. And it's, I think, also the openness, as I said, is extremely important. That when we started up, it was their partners, their doctors, other people who called and they say that this man has a problem, is it something from... But now the men comes for themselves and often see that they have a problem that they need. So they are more upfront. So the openness about, it's kind of been a humanization of men with anger and violence problem in Norwegian society, that it's a problem many men have, and it's it's not that shameful. Of course, it's shameful to use violence, but and it's not accepted to use violence, but they are more humanized. So that I think is we'll come to that step, and that I think is a good thing.
Takže další otázka nebo komentář. Vidím 2 až 3 ruce, takže nejdřív tady prosím paní doktorku, pak kolegyni vzadu a vás za Jonáš. 3.
Dobrý den, já jsem Jarmila Čierná a pracuji v SOS centru. Program pro násilné osoby máme od roku 2008. A já bych se chtěla zeptat, jak pracujete s partnerkami mužů, kteří jsou ve vašem programu, pokud s nimi nějak pracujete, aspoň pan Nordfjell, jestli čtu správně vaše jméno, omlouvám se za případné komolení. Vy jste to konkrétně zmiňoval. A mám ještě jednu otázku, jestli si můžu dovolit. A tahle ta otázka, co jsem řekla, je na ty, kdo prostě pracujete s partnerkami členů skupiny. Druhá otázka je, jestli ve vašich zemích se někdo věnuje násilným ženám. Děkuji.
Takže já bych nejdřív předal slovo Olemu, že na ně byla ta otázka, jak se pracuje s těmi partnerkami, a potom bych poprosil vás všechny, pokud máte nějakou zkušenost, jak se pracuje s násilnými ženami. Všechny panelisty, teda děkuji.
Yes, we have partner contacts, and it's recommended for perpetrators programs to have a partner contact. So one of the reasons is to avoid that the program or the help doesn't escalate the violence, and that to in the assessment of the person or man who does the violence, that it's you have the same stories from the husband or the partner, so that is important. And so we do ask the same question about if they are targeted, about the violence, what kind of violence. So we ask the same question for the husband or the partner and the perpetrators at the beginning, at the end of the program, and then we see is there a change. So that is one of the reasons, and of course, often violence, there is a pattern of violence where the program itself can be used in a violent process. So we want to avoid that. So that is one of the reasons why we have this partner contact. About there have been various shortages about perpetrators programs for women in Norway. So I think now it has improved somewhat, but it's still quite taboo that that women are perpetrators. So I think there is something to be done.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone of you want to comment on the second question?
Maybe just a tendency. Most of the organizations I mentioned, I have started by doing work with men as perpetrators, and they urged somehow even from the state to open up, and some of them changed now for counseling center for violent men and women, not to separate it once again. So it's a tendency into this direction, also on the state level.
I think I'd echo that. What I think might happen in Ireland, there is no work done with female perpetrators, and you might even get into trouble for suggesting that there were any. So that partly, as what may well happen, is I think that if work emerges the issue of female perpetrators, I think what we might be more looking at, well, if there are male perpetrators and female perpetrators, why separate the issue then in lots of ways? We may be looking more at very robust couples work around the issue of domestic violence, because I think then what might happen is we don't always presume that there is always a very clear-cut perpetrator and victim. But I think, and I agree with what colleague said, we have to be so gender sensitive. We have to be sensitive that there may, in some cases, when we're dealing with sadomasochistic men or maybe women who are literally imprisoning their partners and really undermining them at every moment, I think if we come back to what I said earlier, that these men and women are not all the same and the situations have to be looked at. So I think we'd be looking at whether couples counselling with people who know about the dynamics of domestic violence is appropriate, whether there's a man or a woman who you would never put in the same room as their partner to do couples work because they would, the victim would be totally afraid to speak out. So I think I think it's very positive that we hold the gender piece very strongly, but then are open in any individual situations to see what's the evidence base with this couple or this family. What do they need? Do they need separate work for a period, then together? Can they very quickly work together as a family or as a couple? I think eventually the paradigm of keeping them always separate will not continue. But if that's not done with gender safe sensitivity or with sensitivity that there may be a very powerless victim in this relationship who needs very clear protection, I think if work is done without that sensitivity, it will be dangerous. So I think it's really the strength of assessing what's needed with the knowledge that organizations have gained. If that's done well, then we can really work more precisely with families and couples. But we have to be very, very careful and aware of safety of the victim and the children in particular.
Just a side remark or information. What we see if we change the perspective and look to violence in public space, there we have clear tendencies that girls' gangs are doing also girl-girl violence. Yeah, that's at least an interesting phenomenon, asking if girls' gangs are imitating boys' gangs or if there are other patterns or motivations or whatever. But in this field I think we are not such ideologically, it's not such loaded with ideological do's and do nots like the field of domestic violence.
Dámy a pánové, obávám se, že už další otázku úplně nestihneme. Blíží se 5. hodina, proto bych vás chtěl vyzvat, pokud budete mít samozřejmě zájem pokračovat v neformálních diskuzích s našimi hosty. Dovolte mi na závěr všem tady panelistům a hostům tohoto semináře upřímně za Ligu otevřených mužů poděkovat. A také bych chtěl poděkovat lidem, ve kterých by ten seminář se neuskutečnil, a to zejména skvělé ženě v pozadí a koordinátorce Tereze Herdové zde. A také bych chtěl poděkovat našim překladatelům, protože pro ně spousta z našich příměrů je jistě zajímavým oříškem. A přeji vám dobrý večer bez násilí.